and obviously thanks to colleagues at ARK. And it is a first in a number of ways, in my view, not least because of the subject matter. You can tell by my accent, I'm from the south, as it's known here, the Republic of Ireland, and my career started in sociology, as it were, at University College Dublin, in sociology and social policy as two broad disciplines.
That's where I started too.
Yeah, and I moved to Chester, where I started to specialise in the social sciences of sport, and in particular in the sociology of sport, both in teaching and research terms. And obviously finding my way to Jordanstown is probably quite a natural return for me. And it struck me that in my relatively brief time here, I'm starting my third year, actually working, third academic year, working here now. It's not surprising on one level that we don't think perhaps as critically about sport and leisure here and in Ireland generally as we may do in other countries. And I'm not necessarily labelling that as a bad thing, it's more of an observation. And obviously one of the first steps to enable us to better understand what's going on is to be able to draw on hopefully what is methodologically sound and validated research, to be able to discuss it in a public forum like this, and obviously to generate more discussion about that. So in my view, and it might be quite a controversial statement to start with, this area of sport and leisure is generally under-researched and often misunderstood, because we tend to have varying interpretations of what sport and leisure mean. And I'll try to make that clear as I go through some of the findings here, certainly what the survey intended, but how our analysis of that might vary going into the future to help us improve what we know. And this is also unique because in a lot of cases, much of the research on sport and leisure tend to view them separately. So you'll see in a lot of the research in this topic more generally, there's quite a lot of statistical research, surveys in particular, on, for example, rates of participation. Sport England, Sport Northern Ireland, the Irish Sports Council and many others will do that, but usually tend to segregate that in one way or another from what's typically regarded as leisure activities. So this is a good opportunity to be able to address that. I suppose the other context that we are facing specifically in Northern Ireland is the increasing focus on the public health of the nation. Not again unique to Northern Ireland, but it is specific and certainly something that's observable in my time here, particularly the dependency ratio, or the increasing dependency ratio of old to young, and the associated longevity of the population. In other words, people are living together, living longer together, and the welfare state and taxpayers are taking on probably an increasing burden in terms of future healthcare costs for this ageing population. At the same time, there's an increasing concern, if not what some people might describe as an epidemic associated with obesity, amongst other things, amongst other, I guess, health-related concerns. And in amongst all of that, and I'm simplifying as you probably know better than I am, what's a very complex area, in amongst all of that, it has been suggested that sport and physical activity, usually conflated into a sport for all message, can act as some type of preventative or even corrective mechanism for those kinds of concerns or those kinds of issues. But crucially, sport for all encompasses a range of activities that have differential health outcomes. And certainly the research would support that, and we'll come back to look at that later in the presentation. So for that reason, it's important, in my view at least, firstly, to understand exactly what Northern Irish adults are actually doing with their sport and leisure time before we could even then begin to examine the implications of that for the accuracy and, I guess, the implementation of the sport for all message that does permeate throughout this part of the island of Ireland, in fairness, throughout Ireland, and indeed elsewhere in Western Europe. That sport for all message is starting to spread and become very popular at political level and social level. And a lot of national governing bodies are now buying into that kind of philosophy as well. So we'll come back hopefully to have a look at that in a little bit more detail. And as Gillian has just said, this research uses data from the 2009 Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey to explore sport and physical activity amongst the public in Northern Ireland during their leisure time. The questions form part of what's called the International Social Survey Programme, where the same module of questions has already been asked and has the potential to be asked in over 40 countries worldwide. And of course this enables some greater comparative cross-cultural comparison in a unique one-stop shop, i.e. in one kind of survey like this, but also more importantly over time if we've got the facility and the capability to do some follow-up surveys in relation to tracking any changes or patterns over time. This was the first time that a full module of questions within the NILT and within this particular module, the ISSP programme, explored how we spend our leisure time here and how important, at least from the perspective of the respondents, were the activities in their lives. It's based on a representative sample of just over 1,200 adults. I get my figures right. And the data are quite wide-ranging. And out of necessity, simply because of time constraints and a number of other things, Paul and I very specifically have decided we can only focus on a number of themes. Now, we'll cover quite a lot in some of the tables you'll see, so by all means, feel free to raise questions and comments towards the end of that. I'll try and take my time as best I can working through some of the data, because there's nothing worse than paralysis by analysis when it comes to statistics. So I'll quite very specifically pull out some of the themes that have raised concerns for me, and obviously you can feel free to do so yourselves. And what I'm going to try and do is focus the themes around 4 main areas, which will hopefully make sense to you. What we'll do firstly is look at what exactly we do in this part of the world. Moving on to who then does it, in as best we can, have a look at that. And then try and begin to tease out the answers to the very complex questions of how they do it, and more importantly, why we, how and why we do it. And then we'll finish with a brief commentary, at least from my perspective, on some of the attitudinal stuff, very specifically about the perceived role of sport in society. By their very nature, these data are limited in certain format, and I'm quite sure some of you in the audience are probably far more expert than I am at being able to discuss some of the limitations of the data. So the only caveat I'm going to place from my perspective is that I see them as descriptive, and at the moment as at best indicative. So from my perspective, whilst the figures themselves have importance, for example, 92% versus 12% is going to give us a very clear indication of a big statistical difference. At the same time, they're at best indicative. So you'll see at times that I'm going to interject and draw on some of our own work at the Sport and Exercise Sciences Research Institute to try and draw in some of the social science work to hopefully make better sense of what the statistics are telling us, and indeed the limits to them. So let's start with what we do. So just over 1,200 adults, a representative sample based across all of the age groups, social status, socioeconomic status, and so on. And these respondents were asked how often they partook in a list of activities in their free time. And as you can see from the data that we're showing here, there's a wide variety of responses. Again, because we're cross-cutting here between sport and leisure, what I'm going to do now is maybe perhaps to help you make a little bit more sense of it, at least to start the analysis, what I've focused on what might be regarded as the more passive activities versus those that are more physically active, physically demanding, if not even strenuous in one format or another. So if we looked firstly at some of the more passive activities, so these kinds of activities here, for example, which range, as you can see, from left to right, from those that are what we might describe usually as regular participants. These would probably be regarded as more typical of regular participants, right through to those who would participate very little and never. Nearly 3/4 of respondents in total said that they watched TV, DVD, videos every day, whilst a small percentage said that they played cards or board games. And of these, you can see that the top 3 leisure activities undertaken very specifically on a daily or weekly basis were watching TV, DVD and videos, listening to music, and spending time on the internet. And you can see immediately why we'd use the general term passive activities to describe those. On the other hand, in relation to taking part in physical activity, and this is how it's defined here for the purposes of this particular survey. So it's quite a broad definition right now, and we'll come back to that later. So such as sports, going to the gym, going for a walk, only 1 in 5 said that they did so on a daily basis, with a further 27% saying that they did so several times a week, giving an overall total of just under 49%. In contrast to this, nearly 1 in 5 said that they never take part in physical activities like the ones listed here, which would be a range of activities right through from sports to what you might describe arguably as more leisure time. When the same question was asked in the 2007 British Social Attitude Survey, 11% said that they never took part in physical activities. That was in 2007, compared with a higher proportion of 23% in the Republic of Ireland. So in that regard, if we can draw any comparison right now, and it's a limited comparison, you can say that Northern Ireland sits almost halfway in between the Republic and Britain in terms of this category at least. That group of people who say they've never partaken in sports or physical activities. One caveat I'll add to this right now, we might come back and discuss it later. Of course, it's important to note that the question does relate to physical activities, but it's not limited to sport, which does have implications for the kinds of data that are generated and how we understand the differences between the two. And as I say, I'll come back to that later. The figures equally for the TV and internet viewing might also require future clarification. It's something we might come back to later, Paula, as regards the type of programmes, because a notable finding is that almost half of the respondents, just under half, said that they never attend sporting events as spectators, which on one level is quite surprising, given the rhetoric that's associated with sport in Northern Ireland, and indeed the very genuine and serious attempts made by national governing bodies, Sport Northern Ireland and other associated organisations, to promote and have people involved in sports not just as participants, but equally as families, extended family, and the wider culture. So I guess what I'm raising here is something to consider, whether or not many of these participants may have watched sport or those kinds of activities using other media, i.e. potentially on TV, DVD, videos, and on the internet specifically. Because this to me is quite a surprising figure. It's certainly something that we would try and take a look at in more detail to begin to tease out potentially some of the explanations for that. One other thing that struck me this morning as I was preparing, and I'm trying to recall some of the British Social Survey data, again here, this particular category of those that say they never engage in these activities, cultural events, going to the movies, attending sporting events as a spectator, those figures are comparatively higher than in Britain. In the equivalent, the 2007 survey. I'm on the spot now because I can't quite recall what the equivalent is for the Republic of Ireland, but it was the British data that I looked at this morning just before I arrived. And equally, if you look at the other end of that spectrum, it's something to consider in relation to the timing of the survey specifically, because on one level, they are relatively low figures of people who on a daily, if not weekly basis, would go to some kind of cultural event or go to the movies, which obviously wouldn't be described as a cultural event in and of itself. So the timing of that, and obviously the timing of the recession very specifically, might have some role to play in what are potentially, at least in my view, relatively low figures. But again, obviously the best way to look at that is to continue the survey over time and try and track any changes that may happen in due course, and indeed contextualise it in the context of other data that may of course be available within ARK on other aspects of people's lives above and beyond these specific events. So that's quite a quick whistle-stop tour of obviously what is a lot more information on a whole range of activities that, as I said to you earlier, ranges from sport through to leisure. And I've just picked out one or two that I'll obviously comment on later. As we might expect, in amongst all of that, the participation in physical activity isn't uniform across the population. So we're moving now to the second theme, in a sense, to try and tease this out a little bit more, who does what, based on this particular survey. And whilst there was no significant variation between the levels of participation by men and women, this figure here shows that it wasn't the case for age. And on one level, having a look at this, it may, or aspects of it at least, may not be that surprising, but it does warrant consideration at least. Not least when we're thinking ahead in terms of policy planning and implementation as to target groups and what's actually happening in the name of sport and leisure participation. While 1/3 of the youngest group, which is the 18 to 24s, take part in physical exercise daily, this is twice the proportion of the oldest age group. that take part in physical exercise, physical activity daily. And conversely, at the other end of this scale, while only roughly 5% of those aged 18 to 24 never take part in physical exercise, the proportion of those aged 65 years or over not taking part is 45%. Equally, there's a notable drop in the proportion of 25 to 34-year-olds that participate either several times a month, but then quite a significant drop to several times a year. And I say a significant drop, not necessarily in isolation, but in the context of their lives. And of course, that might be explained, for that age group in particular, by changes in lifestyle, if not family or marital status, and other types of commitments at that particular life stage. And again, that's something that might need to be considered further in that regard. This, of course, is focused on adults, so it's 18 upwards. The age groups were predefined, as were all of the categories and the response categories within the survey itself, because this was a survey that was designed internationally, already validated. So we were able to take this and apply it in this context. What we're not seeing here, of course, is the earlier age group in terms of what under 18s are doing before they become adults. And the reason I'm just alerting you to that now, it's predominantly because most of the research that talks about this theme of lifelong participation, and not necessarily in sport, by the way, but in physical activity, which of course would occur in our leisure lives, the research would indicate that the more you are involved in sports, but particularly physical activities at a young age, the far more likely you are to retain that across your adult life. And crucially, between about the ages of 16 to 19, there's a crucial time period, which not surprisingly would coincide with changes in educational status, usually perhaps attending university, depending on the level of privilege of the groups that we might look at. And that's the backdrop to this kind of data, which is alerting us to the fact here, obviously, that certain age groups have quite a significant drop-off at a particular life stage, that not surprisingly, participation in physical activity decreases with age, and I say not surprisingly because that would happen by virtue of the aging process anyway, the biological maturation process. But at the same time, if there is an increasing emphasis upon, let's just call it for now, sport and leisure, as a corrective mechanism for health problems, if not a preventative mechanism for health problems, this, to my mind, is quite a worrying trend. That proportion of an aging population, and we are living longer and becoming more dependent on a smaller ratio of working adults. This is potentially a concern in terms of what the elderly are doing and for future health costs in maintaining that type of aging population. And again, of course, that's not a problem that's unique to Northern Ireland, but nonetheless, we've got very specific data here to be able to tease that out in a little bit more detail. So of the key social demographics which appear to impact greatly, at least on participation, we found that, not surprisingly, as I said to you there, participation decreases with age, greater earning potential, which is a combination of what we've combined in here, would be a combination of actual income and being employed, employment status. So that greater earning potential leads to higher participation. Having a degree, and for the purposes of this, I've included in that also having some kind of PC skills, because this question about PC skills was asked as a separate question in the survey, but it had a clear correlation, associations with degree in education. That also impacts on the likelihood of greater participation. And of course, as we said earlier, being a sports spectator impacts favourably on participation in physical exercise. And equally, the groups that are most likely to participate in regular physical activity or exercise also have active social networks. That is, they're already involved in other types of leisure activities. So specifically, as we're finding in this data set, those who are regularly participating in physical exercise also get together regularly with friends, according to the data we're finding here. They also get together regularly with relatives, which was a separate category in the survey. they listen to music, and they go to actually watch sporting events. And this pattern of responses does confirm British and other research, including the Republic, which suggests that participation in physical activity tends to reflect those with higher levels of what we might call social capital. So the social dimension of class, we're not just focusing on the economic dimension of class, but the social dimension, the relationships that make up our social networks that are said to have bonding or bridging effects for us, that enable us to be more involved in society more generally, such that being involved in those networks actually regenerates individual people, but more importantly has knock-on effects in other aspects of our lives. In this case, either spilling over into sport and leisure participation, or vice versa, from sport and leisure participation spilling over into those aspects of our lives. And obviously class and the very specific socio-economic definition of class has an impact. It's clear from the data here that having a higher household income, which we might regard as the quite typical narrow definition of class, that's associated with more frequent participation. Okay, so we've had a brief look at what they actually do, who does what, or at least focusing on some of the key social demographics of who does what. And what I want to do now is move to the theme that tries to deal with how they do it, to get a little bit more information on that. And of those who do take part in physical activity, which was 53% of respondents, they were asked to identify the sport or physical activity that they do most frequently. And this table shows the most common activities identified by those respondents. Now those activities, just to clarify for you, you'll see the lowest figure is here. We've simply focused on that bottom threshold figure. We've focused on those activities selected by 4% or more, simply for the purposes of today's presentation. One thing that certainly stands out or stood out for me very quickly in relation to knowledge of research happening in other countries about what's described sometimes as changing sporting repertoires, the changing ways of, the changes in how people participate in sport, which according to all the research is broadening in one way or another. And this takes us right back to my opening comments about the sport for all message, which is taking us beyond competitive, institutionalized, rigorous physical activities, very specifically what we might typically associate with the national governing bodies, into a far broader conception. And one noteworthy finding in that regard is that the percentage who engage in walking here is relatively lower than in the Republic or in Britain. Now, it's something that we will certainly, I think, if we're going to focus on this a bit more for future publications, try to go back and tease out very specifically how exactly walking was defined, to try and understand the perception of respondents who focused on this, because walking, of course, could range from going to the shop twice a day through to hill walking, which we know, of course, in Britain has a very strong support from certain sectors of the society, the Countryside Association and so on. So that may be something to consider in relation to trying to make sense of the particular figure that's relevant here for Northern Ireland. And equally, although we've seen already, or I've indicated to you already, that there were no significant differences between the levels of activities between males and females, there were, from these data, some indications of gendered preferences for activities, or what we might even describe as gendered patterns of activities. So for males, the most frequent sports were soccer and golf. And you'll pardon my stereotypical use of blue and pink, but I thought it was the easiest way to try and identify this for you. And for females, the most popular activities for those were fitness, as it was described at least in this particular survey, and cycling. So what you have here are the overall figures. And those figures broke down quite differently, as it were, between the two sexes. Let me give you an indication of them at least. For males, the figure of participation for soccer was 22%, and for golf 11%, whilst for females, fitness was at 20% and cycling at 6%. And this pattern, again, not surprisingly, supports much of the previous research on gender and sports, but also challenges us to consider whether current investment in sports and activities is potentially targeted at those that are actually, or those activities that are actually popular with the public, from their perspective at least, based on the data that we're looking at here. The last thing I'd say about this slide, and again it struck me this morning in terms of thinking about the range of activities, and jogging being a separate activity on its own, swimming is particularly a standout one in relation to some of the research data in the Republic of Ireland at least, and indeed elsewhere, but it certainly became clear in some of the research I was involved in relation to gendered participation in sport in the South, that swimming was shown to be one of the activities that was closest to being a gender-neutral activity, if I can use that term. In other words, that there weren't significant differences between males and females' participation in swimming, and that equally at the same time it was quite high on the level of participation for the population as a whole, which is why I raise my question, I guess, to consider about the considerations that we would make in relation to government investment into the kinds of types and levels of activities that are genuinely popular with the public, but that equally may actually demonstrate to have the health benefits that it's claimed they do. And I'll come back to that towards the end again. So that's a brief overview of how they do it, and I focus very specifically there on some gendered aspects to that, and obviously on the overall levels. It is important to explore the reasons why they say they do it, and more importantly what they say they get out of it, which might have an impact on behaviour in the first place. And of those who take part in physical activities, the vast majority said that they get some enjoyment out of it, with only a small percentage saying that they get no or not much enjoyment. So you'll see the categories across the top were those that were given to respondents in terms of enjoyment. And of those who participate in sport and physical activities, and that's ranging for the purposes of this analysis right now, right through from daily or weekly through to yearly participation. So we've conflated them into a group that participate in comparison to those who never participate. 58% get a great deal of enjoyment. Now, as I say, that's conflating everybody who claims to be involved on a daily basis right through to a yearly basis. But when we extrapolate that a little bit more and we focus only on those who participate regularly within that category, that figure reduces to 44%. So in other words, 44% of regular participants say that they also get a great deal of enjoyment from that participation. And as we might imagine, those who undertake physical activity most regularly are also the most likely to say that they get a great deal of enjoyment. Males were more likely than females to say that they got a great deal of enjoyment. And coming back to that 25 to 34-year-old age group, the one I alerted to you earlier where there was quite a significant drop, respondents in that age group were least likely to say that they got a great deal of enjoyment, compared with those of the younger age group, whom we saw, not surprisingly, had a higher level of participation. So I'll say that again. Respondents in the 25 to 34 years age group were least likely to say that they got a great deal of enjoyment in comparison to the 18 to 24 years. Though I would have to say that these differences weren't statistically significant. But nonetheless, statistics aren't everything. They just point to aspects of our lives that we probably need to examine in a bit more detail. So that figure of 58% is for those who participate, irrespective of the frequency. But focusing on those who do participate regularly, given that 44% of those get a great deal of enjoyment out of it, we should then ask why the other 56% have lower levels of enjoyment. ranging from some fair amount down to no, not much, which were the two categories that were given. And we could explore this, in part at least, by looking at how important respondents rated each of the 4 reasons why they take part in sport or games, which is the table on the bottom here, the second table. And as you'll see, not surprisingly, health reasons were important for most respondents. Almost 90% said that they did sport or games for their physical or mental health reasons or motivations. In a sense, at least in my view, looking at all the research in the area, that's probably an indication of the socialisation and the taking on board of some of the public messages, public health messages very specifically, about our individual responsibility for health in one way or another. That said, again, there are some gendered differences. Men are more likely, or were more likely, to take part in sport or games for different reasons than females. Nearly half of men said that competition against others was very or somewhat important, compared with 28% of females. And conversely, looking good, or to look good, which was this one down at the bottom, was very or somewhat important to about 43% of females, compared to a smaller proportion for males. And again, that's not surprising when we link this back to the gendered preferences for activities that I showed you earlier. If you recall, fitness and cycling were the 2 most popular activities for females, and soccer and golf were the 2 most popular activities for males. Respondents were also asked about their general health. So around 1/2 of respondents, 49% to be specific, described their health as excellent or very good. And obviously, of course, that's important to ask, because it's going to have some bearing on at least the reasons why they're taking part, and indeed the types of activities themselves. And those respondents who participated in regular physical exercise were more likely to say that their health is better than those who don't participate in regular exercise. And you might be very well sitting there thinking, well, she started out in Dublin, she did her PhD in sociology, she specialised in sport, and she has this wonderful title of doctor. And what she's just said is not exactly groundbreaking. That those who participate in regular physical exercise were more likely to say their health was better than those who don't. But this is a crucial point. While it might suggest at face value that exercise is the cause of improved health, it might also be the case that healthier people do more physical exercise. So we need to be cautious, at least, about establishing a cause-effect relationship in one direction only. So it may not be as simple as saying engaging in physical exercise generates X, Y, and Z for health benefits. Because it might be that by virtue of being healthier people are predisposed, for want of a better word, to participating in sports and leisure activities quite specifically. So that's just a caveat. And again, it comes back to the limits of statistics in particular, and their ability to establish, at least when you're studying people and human behaviour, which is a difficult task, establishing a very clear direction for cause-effect relationships. And the 4th category I wanted to briefly at least outline to you today was the attitudes to sport that were revealed in the latter part of the survey. And in this particular section of the survey, respondents were asked about their attitudes to the role of sport within society. And in overall terms, sport was viewed positively. So the vast majority of respondents, 87%, agreed or strongly agreed that taking part in sports develops children's character. What we might describe as the cohesive potential of sport was also recognised, with more than 2/3 of respondents saying that sports bring different groups and races within Northern Ireland closer together. However, they were less definite in relation to their views on what they described as international sport. So 1/3, or 37% to be specific, felt that international sport competitions create more tension between countries than necessarily good feelings. So that's quite an interesting juxtaposition of a very positive view of the role of sport within Northern Ireland, but not necessarily the same view about sport as an international mechanism for, we can use the same terms here, I guess, social integration or social cohesion. And again, I was reflecting on that this morning with a view to thinking about how to take the research forward. And certainly one thing we might do is go back and consider the timing of the survey. And I can't quite recall it off the top of my head, but I was wondering, were there any major international events in sports events specifically, either positive or negative at the timing of the survey, that we might need to consider in terms of explaining this? And again, it'll only be a limited explanatory ability. But at the same time, that's quite a significant change in terms of the positive views of people about the internal role of sport, the importance of sport in integrating communities in Northern Ireland in comparison to generating international tension. Finally, and again, this is probably not surprisingly, about 1/2 of the respondents agreed or strongly agreed that the Northern Irish government should spend more money on sports. As I say, probably not surprising on one level, but it does alert us on another level to the general perception that sport, and not necessarily leisure, so i.e. not necessarily physical exercise or physical activity, should or would, according to the general public, require more government investment. So that was quite a specific response in relation to sport, quite specifically. How are we doing on time, Julian?
Yeah, a few more minutes.
Okay, good. Because I've got a couple of kind of discussion points, if that's all right. Let me try and draw these together in a brief conclusion at least, because I'm sure, and as I say, it's quite a widespread, so I apologise for spreading so much information across you, but I'm sure you'll pick up on some of it. Most respondents take part in some sort of sport or physical activity. We can say that quite clearly. Although 2 in 10 never do so, according to this survey. And the reasons for participation are numerous, although, as I've shown to you earlier, health reasons predominate, according to the respondents themselves. And those health reasons ranged from what they described as physical to mental health reasons. So that brings me right back to the start of the presentation when I spoke to you about this widening emphasis on the sport for all concept, which takes us, as I say, beyond competitive institutionalised, national governing body-led sports into the realm of physical activity, exercise and leisure. And what then of this particular concept and its proven links to health, if the vast majority of respondents are saying that one of their primary motivations is for health reasons, then we, quite rightly I think, should ask, well, does their engagement in those activities generate the very health benefits they're claiming is their motivation? The research is very clear on this by my colleagues at the Sports and Exercise Research Institute, if not around the world, that there are 2 very clear differences between participation in sport and participation in what we would describe as physical activity stroke exercise. And this, in its simplest format, because I don't have an awful lot of time, is how you would summarise it. That regular, rhythmic, moderate exercise, RRM is how I describe it to our students to try and help them to recall it. Regular, rhythmic, moderate exercise is proven to benefit physical health and well-being. But the evidence for sport, as in competitive, institutionalised, rigorous physical activities, is less clear. So the evidence is very clear in relation to the physiological benefits of participating in physical activity and exercise, ranging right through from studies on blood pressure, heart rate, lung capacity, VO2 max, all of those kinds of activities, muscle strength, bone to muscle ratio, preventative effects for later life in terms of osteoporosis, and so on. Preventative, if not corrective, effects for conditions like diabetes, cholesterol, again, and so on. I'm probably skimming it very briefly, but I'm aware that there's time constraints. So the kinds of activities that are proven, and it's very clear by the researchers all around the world, that generate health benefits are the likes of jogging, walking, rhythmic, regular, moderate exercise, gardening. Activities in which adult people can choose voluntarily to do in their own time, without necessarily any time pressures, and with little or no competitive element. Because when we go to the other end of the continuum, and on the other end of the continuum is described sport, competitive institutionalized activities that are physically rigorous, they are far more likely to generate injuries. And not just one-off types of injuries, but probably critically from our perspective when we're thinking about the health costs and the health benefits. Crucially, there's very little evidence, or research I should say, in the first instance, for us to be able to assess what are the long-term health costs of participation in sport. Long-term health costs. And I'm thinking there of, in very specific terms, the cost to the NHS of dealing with A&E sports injuries. As just one specific example. Probably even more generally, the long-term consequences of athletes who deal with the onset of arthritis. Cartilage injuries, which require treatment 20 and 30 years later. We're not thinking very specifically even within the lifespan of an athlete or a player themselves, but in the long term. Now, I'm not trying to be pessimistic or negative or any of the terms that certainly some people might use to describe that kind of perspective on the world. What I'm simply doing is saying that we're very clear that the evidence for the role of physical activity and exercise as a beneficial mechanism for health is clear, but the evidence is not clear for sport, which takes us right back to the definition of exactly what sport for all means. Because currently, at least, for a whole series of political and social reasons, sport for all has been bought into by most of the national governing bodies. Here and other parts of the world, we're not unique in that regard. But it's been bought in with a view to maintaining levels of funding to keep delivering programmes and so on. In other words, national governing bodies themselves are claiming to move their expertise or their attention beyond sport into exercise and health. So that's one thing, but what we don't know is whether or not they're actually delivering on that, and whether or not, therefore, the positive effects for health are proven in relation to that widening concept of sport for all. I suppose the other standout point, and we need to come back to it, is the fact that 44% of those exercising regularly say they get a great deal of enjoyment, which of course raises questions about the other 56% who by implication say they get a lower level of enjoyment. And that indeed might reflect something of the public health messages which I mentioned to you earlier. It does raise the question, it's something we need to consider. Are a lot of people beginning to exercise because it's seen as good for them, but they're not necessarily enjoying it? And that's quite an introverted public health message. If the message is clear, and I'm sure it is, and we all receive it in so many different ways, you do your 5 times a week, 30 minutes of regular, rhythmic, moderate exercise. That might even vary in type. You can do it in shorter bouts more frequently. There's a debate amongst the sports scientists about quite the length of the bout of exercise. But it does beg us the question to ask, why would more than half of the respondents not get a great deal of enjoyment? And it may very well be, I'm only suggesting here something to think about, that they're doing it simply because it's good for them. At the same time, however, nearly half of those aged 65 or older say that they never take part. And this, of course, warrants greater attention, not least because of the changing demographics of the Northern Irish population and concerns about preventative health care for those people that are living longer, maintaining your health for a longer period of time, concerns about the social isolation of the elderly and the ageing population. Because as we've just indicated here, social networks, if they can be built within sport and leisure, can spill over into other aspects of lives. So there may be something to consider in that regard. And this leads me to the very last slide, and to a question which is certainly not easily answered in relation to the evidence. It brings us back to this idea about social capital and the social bonds, or the bridges, as it were, that allow us to build those links, and the importance that might have very specifically for those populations who are not involved for a range of reasons in sports and physical activities. And I've just identified, obviously, for you the group of the elderly. Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, is a fantastic example of this. I'm sure you've all heard of that in one way or another. And he talks about the mutual reinforcement of social capital and the differences there is between bowling alone and bowling as a group. The very last question I'll pose for you is whether or not we are, by virtue of those data sets, getting value for money. And this, of course, is a key term and a key question in the current economic status that we have. Are we getting value for money in terms of the government's investment in sport for all? Based on what we're seeing here, there is undoubtedly a confusion, from potentially at least from the perspective of the respondents, about whether participation in sport is good for health in comparison to participation in exercise. The scientific research is clear on that, but the public understanding of it may not be as clear. And to try to defend the public for a minute, in Joe Public's defence, many of the national governing bodies and those that have political or social investment in sport are themselves not clear, because the message has been broadened into a sport for all message, into a far wider conglomeration of activities. Not all, at least in terms of our current state of research, we know generate the kinds of benefits that is claimed currently. Leaving that suspended, just for a minute, there is, of course, greater scope from this study to generate comparisons with the Republic and with Britain over time, equally, and to build from this in terms of understanding further exactly what's happening in sport and leisure within Northern Ireland. This is obviously just the first step, and we'd hope to try and pursue that further. And I think you've heard enough from me for now.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you very much, Katie. That was really very interesting, and made me think about things in a slightly different way to I might have before your presentation. So is there any comments, questions, or otherwise? As Katie has said, the Life and Times data is available on the website, and people can go back and look at the full range of questions and the full range of information that are there, and analyse it, or come back to us, Katie or Paula, or if there's other things you would like to add off the data. But for now, do you have any comments or observations that you want to make by way of from your experience? If anyone wants to add anything?
Yeah, can I just say, Dirk will know this better. You were saying about how this is a Life and Time survey, so it's just responding to age 18. We're talking about lifetime participation. The Young Life and Time survey, which is a survey that ARK also runs of 16-year-olds, is going in complete in the next few weeks. There will be a short set of questions about the leisure time activities of 16-year-olds. It's not necessarily with the same focus as that, but again, hopefully this time next year we might have a better idea of the leisure time activities, hopefully including physical activity and or sport of that group, and might give us a better idea, as I say, of what that group are involved with.
Thank you, Paul. Any other comments?
What do you think? Did you find anything surprising in there that you thought stood out for any reason? I'm sure there was. And I hold my hands up. You spotted as well, Gillian? Thanks. My apologies.
We're numbers. One of the things I was interested in was some of your opening comments, which were about where Northern Ireland figures are located in relation to earlier research in the Republic of Ireland and in Britain. And I think on some of the variables you were finding that Northern Ireland was sort of in the middle between the two.
Yeah.
My initial thought had been that it may be related to poverty, or indeed the experience of the conflict, that people perhaps weren't as able to get out and participate in sports and leisure activities for a number of years. And maybe, I know personally speaking, if I get in the habit of going to my good for me class, I'll go, but then the habit breaks and not able to go, and then I get out of the habit very quickly. Is there an element, is there some element to maybe the poverty, maybe the conflict, and maybe, you know, the inability to move freely around that may have impacted, particularly amongst older groups?
I think undoubtedly. Paula, would you say anything on that? I would say that there's something certainly in relation to social capital and poverty. Now, whether that for you means it's drawing on aspects of the history of community relations and conflictual community relations specifically. I don't know whether you'd add anything to that.
It's not something that we've explored, but I would say there must be huge. And the other thing is in terms of rurality as well, in terms of where people live. But again, you would expect that to be an issue in other parts of Britain and Ireland as well. But and just going back in terms of public policy and investment in particular things. So it's a historical impact as well. But I mean, I think there has been some work done in terms of sport and community relations in Northern Ireland. It's obviously a unique feature of here that wouldn't be an issue in other parts. That is bound to have an impact.
I can give you some other examples of them, Gillian, just of compare. I mean, I didn't present them here, but for example, there 39% of Northern Irish respondents get together with relatives weekly compared to a lower percentage in Britain. But at the same time, 20% in Northern Ireland never read books compared to a slightly lower percentage in Britain. 31% of Northern Irish respondents never go to the movies compared with 28% in Britain. So yeah, you're right to pick up on that in one way, I think.
And I suppose the other question I have, if I can just ask it before somebody else does. So are you basically advocating that instead of a sport for all message, it should be a exercise for all message rather than sport?
If the motivation or the impetus is to do something about the health of the nation, then to my mind, it's absolutely clear. If we were all of one mind this minute, we were sitting in the assembly and we said, right, what can we do to improve the health of the nation? We've got a certain pot of money that's come through some kind of sports or leisure stream. It's very clear to me that we would focus it, at least in the first instance, on physical activity and exercise. Now, that's not to say we throw the baby out with the bathwater, that sport doesn't have a role to play, because it clearly does in terms of the development of personality and character. If some people might arguably say mental well-being, coping with particular types of situations. But the preponderance of physiological health benefits come from physical activity and exercise.
But isn't it that in our heads we think the two is the same? So we hear sport and we think, well, actually, we don't think of formal, competitive, organised sport. We think of exercise. I'm not sure. I don't know if we asked any questions about that.
Well, crucially, the discriminator here is the type of activity. So if you can remember the RRM message, regular, rhythmic, moderate, in comparison to vigorous, physical, which takes you into the realm of sport, usually at least, then that'll help you at least identify the kinds of physical activity, even from your own personal perspective. You're leaving here today and you're thinking, I'm going to go for a walk for 20 minutes.
Well, I am a bit confused because I'm not sure whether I do sport or exercise.
Yeah.
And I had always sort of thought sport for all just meant exercise for all, really. And, you know, the sort of competitive thing that you're talking about, right at the continuum, is a fairly minority thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the people who play golf regularly or who play tennis regularly but don't play in competitions, are they doing exercise or sport? Depends
on, well, the actual level in which they participate, and I don't mean necessarily amateur elite, but you'll know yourself in terms of, you know, you can think about your heart rate or the kinds of exertion that you feel after participation. That's going to be the crucial discriminator in terms of health benefits. So getting your heart rate above resting level, but not taking it into its maximal capacity, keeping it mid-level.
That's RRM.
That's RRM, and that's health benefits. I wouldn't get too worried about trying to decide for yourself, am I participating in sport or exercise in that regard, because the point is, as long as you get the health benefits, it doesn't matter what it's called. My point about the definitions comes back particularly to government investment, because government are claiming to invest in sport for the benefit of health.
But I would have thought
that would be less clear.
Really for most people, it comes to the same thing.
It's all in one.
Yeah.
Are you a question? Yeah.
I was just going to say it's an interesting point about investment, because as you may be aware, about 3 weeks ago, the Committee for Culture, Arts and Leisure released a report on sport and physical activity. And one of the standout recommendations for me was that partly that physical activity was recognised equally to sport, but also that the way in which government has to invest in it, they recommend, was to recognise it across all of the departments. not just through the Department for Culture, Arts and Leisure. So that it's up to for regional development, for example, to make sure that the infrastructure is there so that people enjoy sport, so that the roads network is good enough for us to enjoy cycling. Department of Education have to buy in. You know, it's really across government. So one of the things that we're doing is to scrutinise the new programme of government as it is discussed over the next few months to ensure that there's buy-in across all government.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I'm hoping I'm not coming across as being necessarily overly critical, because that's not my point by any means. There is inevitably, for anybody working at policy level, governmental level, an inevitable tension between the desire to deliver mass participation, mass enjoyment of, let's just use the terms sport and leisure, versus the other tension, of course, which is to try and support elite level sport. And not surprisingly, there are fewer that participate in the other category, elite level sport, but it costs more. And it is one challenge, one hell of a challenge for governments to balance that tension. And that tension varies over time. For instance, if you looked potentially, and I'm saying this speculatively now, I'd probably go back and try and look at it for myself, at the kinds of discussions that have been happening here in relation to investment in sport for the next 4 years, they will have been very different to 10 years ago because of London 2012. So that political context will undoubtedly have some kind of impact. Again, not by any means unique to this part of the world. It's the challenge for government to try to take care of, as it were, the population as a whole, whilst at the same time investing at the elite level support structures that are getting more and more demanding for sport.
The one thing that interests me most, I have to say, is when you present the figure about people taking part but not enjoying it.
Yeah.
So you sort of wonder, are those the people who are being told they have to do it in order to lose weight or eat healthy or whatever? Or are there people who have to cycle to work because they have no other means of getting to work? Or so, and I wonder, you know, we know there's a health benefit of being happy and having self-esteem and all the rest of it, but if they're not enjoying it.
Well, we're not saying they're not enjoying it, but they have lower levels of enjoyment in comparison to those that were in that category.
Well, I wonder whether done more research on whether at that point then it becomes actually counterproductive, whether it's actually not healthy to tell someone you have to do 30-minute sport in order to lose weight, and they hate it. You know, how healthy. Because
the psychological consequences can be devastating. Yeah. Yes, of course. And that's the challenge for all the sports scientists who are dealing with the actual physiological research on this, is to translate the public message, but to try and get a buy-in from the general public. Again, I'm thinking back to the under 18s that we haven't been able to look at in this survey, but of the current research that's engaged with children's activity levels, not surprisingly because of concerns about this apparent epidemic of obesity. It's pointing to the social capital effects again, that the children that are more likely to be physically active, and therefore potentially at least to hold off on concerns in relation to obesity, are those who are involved in families or networks that are physically active themselves. So actually a lot of the research quite late on children's physical activity levels has moved away from focusing on them as individuals within a school context, that's where most of the stuff has been done in PE, into family lifestyles and trying to track children and parents over time. So we have that kind of similar effect, but it's at a younger age group.
Okay.